name of God, in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen.
Amen.
So apparently it's not much fun being a prophet. How often have you heard the saying, "Don't blame me, I'm just the messenger"? Yeah. But the problem is that the messenger frequently gets confused with A, the message itself, or B, the one from whom the message really comes. And that's probably just as it should be, because the messenger has to be in some kind of relationship with both the message and the one from whom the message really comes. Otherwise, the messenger would have nothing to say. Amos was a classic Old Testament prophet. He was called by God out of obscurity. He had no particular talent for the task that God gave him to do. And though he spoke the truth in love, the truth wasn't really what people wanted to hear. As a result, he was rejected and persecuted and ultimately killed. Amos was called by God during a relatively affluent time in ancient Hebrew society. Relatively affluent and relatively unjust. How sad it is that those two things so often seem to come together. During Amos's time, those who were rich and powerful became particularly disdainful of those who were poor and weak. In fact, the power and wealth of those who were well off were frequently gained by oppressing and marginalizing those who had very little or nothing at all. And lots of people fell through the cracks in that society. The widows and orphans, the poor and uneducated, and the outcast and the marginalized. In a word, all of those for whom God always seems to have a very special place in God's heart. And so it became Amos's dubious honor to tell it like it was. And of course, no one really wanted to hear it. So they asked him to leave, which is pretty tame compared to what usually happens to the prophets. However, tradition does have it that Amos was ultimately killed by Jeroboam II, against whom he prophesied. And then there's John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, John. Another classic Old Testament prophet, although here he is right in the middle of the New Testament. John, too, was called by God out of obscurity. He had no particular talent for the task that he was given to do. And though he spoke the truth in love, the truth really wasn't what people wanted to hear. As a result, he was rejected and persecuted and ultimately killed. And John's biggest mistake was that he stepped on some really big toes. Herod Antipas, was as ruthless a leader as the people of Jesus' time ever had known. He was a Jew, which somehow made him seem even worse to them, because he was supposed to be one of them. But instead, he was brought to power, and he was kept in power by collaborating with the occupying forces of Rome, and by oppressing his very own people. He seemed to be the very embodiment of evil and greed, and he probably would have made great material for the railing of any true prophet of ancient Israel. But what's really fascinating is that he apparently was tolerated by Herod apparently tolerated John the Baptist and was even fascinated by him, which is really kind of interesting. Some scholars speculate that Herod must have been just plain crazy, which is probably true. But personally, I wonder if maybe given a little more time or different circumstances, John might have been able to convert Herod, because Herod was listening to John. He was listening. And that was why Herodias hated him so much. She hated John because he spoke against her unlawful marriage to Herod. Both she and Herod had left their former spouses in order to marry one another. And in that culture and society, that was against the law. It was against the law. So Herodias hated John all the more because Herod actually liked to listen to him. And she knew he was a threat. John was, in a word, dangerous to her. She saw him as a threat to her status of unlawfully gained power and wealth. At any rate, it was really because of her that John ended up being murdered. Because of jealousy or fear or hate, or maybe all those things. Speaking the truth in love to someone who doesn't want to hear it can be dangerous business indeed. Prophets most often end up dead because people who don't want to hear the truth, even if it is spoken in love, can think of no other way to silence it but to kill the messenger. To kill the messenger. But you know what? That never really works, does it? It doesn't. Love always wins. Truth always wins. God always wins. Always. So Amos and John the Baptist were both forerunners of Jesus Christ. Jesus, too, was called by God out of obscurity. And if you've ever been to Nazareth, you know that that's true. He had no particular talent for the task that God gave him to do. He was a small-town carpenter, right? And though he spoke the truth in love, the truth wasn't really what people wanted to hear. As a result, he was rejected and persecuted and ultimately killed. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Yeah. The most fascinating part of the pattern is that it continues to our own time. God has called people down through the ages to be prophets, to speak the truth of God in love, whether people want to hear it or not. God calls us to be prophets too. We are called to stand with those who are poor and marginalized and oppressed against the structures and powers that impoverish and marginalize and oppress them. And that can be dangerous business indeed, because the structures and powers that most often impoverish and marginalize and oppress people today are the same ones. They're the same ones that killed Amos and John the Baptist and Jesus the Christ. And though most of us fancy ourselves to be quite advanced nowadays, and perhaps even beyond such barbarities, please be assured that there's nothing further from the truth. We still live in a world in which the poor and the weak and the vulnerable are abused and marginalized by those who are rich and powerful and in charge. We still live in a world in which people manipulate systems of power and politics and even of religion for their own gain. It's not that unusual. It happens everywhere. It even happens right here. But God, our mighty God, still speaks the truth in love. God still stands with the poor and the weak and the vulnerable. God still heals and reconciles and causes all things to work together for good. Christ is still crucified, and Christ still rises from the dead every day. Every day. Which brings me to the subject of mixing politics and religion, right? A hot-button issue in our own time, to be sure. So first of all, it's important to realize that the separation of church and state simply refers to the fact that our government is not allowed to tell us what to believe and what not to believe with regard to our religion. That's what separation of church and state is. Separation of church and state is supposed to keep the state out of religion, not vice versa. So there's that. Secondly, and most importantly, you can probably see from today's readings that the Bible has plenty to say about politics. It surely does. From Moses, who railed against the injustice of imperial Egypt, and finally followed God's orders to commit massive political insurrection by leading all the Hebrew slaves out of slavery, and against Pharaoh with his imperial military power machine, Moses. From Moses to Amos and all the Old Testament prophets, to John the Baptist, and to Jesus of Nazareth, who was ultimately killed by both the political and the religious authorities of his day. The Bible has plenty to say about politics and religion. And that must be because God has plenty to say about politics and religion. And that means that as followers of Jesus Christ, we should have plenty to say about politics and religion. Christians are always obliged to speak truth to power. We are the conscience of the world. That's part of our call. Christians are always obliged to speak truth to power. The times down through the centuries when we have not had the courage to do that have been some of the darkest and most horrible times of human history. Think of Nazi Germany. They have been the most horrible times in human history because Christians did not speak for God. We are always obliged to speak the truth to power. And we're obliged to speak the truth in love. In love. And in absolute, unequivocal nonviolence. No physical violence, no verbal violence, no emotional violence, no spiritual violence, no violence, ever. Speak truth to power and speak the truth in love. But speak the truth. Speak God's truth, no matter what. It's never easy to speak the truth of God or to live the will of God. And sometimes we get hurt. And sometimes we even get our heads chopped off. But that's what happens to prophets of God. And we've all been called by God to be prophets. We are called by God to be in relationship with the message and with the one from whom the message comes. It might not always be easy, but remember that Jesus Christ is our model and our example. And ultimately, love always wins. Truth always wins. God always wins. Always.